Okay, so as you all know, my name's Jakki, and I look specifically at drag queen culture in Central Kansas. And in this particular presentation, I'm looking at how 7 drag queens in Central Kansas specifically navigate like their racial identities and how they came to consciousness about them. So a little bit of background about myself. I'm a graduating senior, double majoring in print journalism and American ethnic studies and double minoring in women's studies and queer studies. And I have accepted a position in the graduate program to receive a Master's of Arts in the Department of Communication Studies here at K-State. A little bit of like positioning myself within this research is I've been doing this research now for more than 3 years. Specifically looking at drag culture in Central Kansas, which I define as the cities of Junction City, Manhattan, Topeka, and Lawrence. While it's not the geographic third of this state as a whole, it's really where drag culture exists outside of major metropolises like KCK, KCMO, and then Wichita. Just generally speaking, queer culture tends to interact very differently in more urban spaces than in these predominantly rural communities. This started in 2012 when, as a coverage article for the Collegian, which is the daily newspaper here at K-State, and that same semester I took photojournalism, where I highlighted a drag performer at the time who was also a K-State student. So it turned into a day in the life of photo story of a drag performer, and pretty much the research has continued since, and my goal is to make it into a thesis, fingers crossed potentially for a full-blown dissertation, but I doubt that will happen because I want to get out of Kansas once I get my master's. Anyway, regardless, I would like to write a book about the research that I've done and the people that I've met and the experiences that have kind of shaped both like my experience as well as like those who have assisted me with this research. So next, a little bit about like how this presentation is formatted. So simply put, this presentation is about drag queens, and I'll explain why it's specifically about drag queens in a little bit. I'll introduce it, give a pretty broad overview of the literature that exists. I will describe the setting, provide some of the methods that I use. I'll introduce the queens that assisted me with this in particular. And then kind of look at like the racial interactions and the results of this research in particular. So, Schott and Underwood, 2004, used the terms drag queens and female impersonator interchangeably in the Drag Queen Anthology, but define both as individuals who publicly perform, quote, being women in front of an audience that knows that they are men, regardless of how compellingly female or real they might otherwise appear. Taylor and Rupp further explain how drag queens are gay men who dress and perform as, but do not want to be women or have women's bodies. These definitions are accurate for some drag queen performers, but not accurate for all. And in all actuality, they are very exclusionary in how they are defined. And this is a serious problem that I have and a major critique that I have of the researchers in them of themselves on the basis that even when their own participants define themselves as like trans women who perform in drag, they still refer to them as essentially like men who perform femininity in drag, right? And so it's super sloppy research that exists, but it is kind of like a starting point of how some people perceive what a drag queen is. So this research specifically highlights drag queens in Central Kansas who identify as cisgender gay men outside of their drag identity. Kind of going back to sloppy research, there are trans women who perform as drag queens in Central Kansas, but because their experiences and identities outside of drag and in drag are completely different, it's such poor research to compare those different identities, which is why I didn't. There are trans individuals, both trans men and women, who assist me with this research, and to have talked very vibrantly about their racial experiences. But for this, I specifically looked at 7 cisgender gay men outside of their drag queen identity. So they navigate various identities, both in and out of their drag persona, and this article just really, this research really focuses on like racial dynamics, both of people who self-identify as people of color, consisting of various identities, as well as white performers, and how they navigate their differences yet similarities. So kind of looking at the literature that exists, there are 3 main ethnographies that exists, 3 main books that exist kind of looking at drag culture in general over the years. One is Mother Camp, which came out in the late 1960s. That was written by Esther Newton, and she used it as like a thesis, and then it turned into a dissertation, and then it turned into a book. So, and then the drag queens at the 801 Cabaret, Mother Camp was emphasized drag in Chicago, and then Drag Queens of the 801 Cabaret was research conducted by Taylor and Rupp in Miami in the early to mid 2000s. Both of these have performers of color who self-identify as individuals of color, so identifying as something other than exclusively white. But nowhere in either book do they specifically address how these performers interact with their racial identities. Specifically looking at it in very urban areas where there are predominantly more people of color in a closer space. So the 2 main tracks of the literature of drag performers interacting directly with race exist in ballroom culture and in the instance of RuPaul. So looking at ballroom culture, Butch Queen's Up and Pump's Gender Performance of Ballroom Culture in Detroit is a very contemporary look at, as it's self-titled, ballroom culture in Detroit. Marlon Bailey really looks at how race, gender performance, gender identity all kind of interact in ballroom culture. It's a little bit different contemporarily looking at it compared to like Paris is Burning, the documentary that was released in the early 1990s, which looked at ballroom culture in New York during the late 1980s. They're labeled similarly, but the context and the findings are very different. And then coming out of Paris is Burning is this massive academic discussion between Bell Hooks and Judith Butler, specifically in regard to how when Butler critiques Paris is Burning, she completely disregards the adherence and aspiration to white hegemonic ideals. That is specific in regard to gender performance, gender presentation, and socioeconomic status. Many of the people in Paris, and this is directly what Hooks states, is that we can't critically look at Paris is Burning on the basis that all of these individuals are aspiring to this like upper class white hegemonic ideal of like fame and fortune, which they will never be able to achieve on the basis that they're low socioeconomic individuals of color, some of whom are also like hold other levels of marginalization. And then kind of switching gears contemporarily, looking at RuPaul Charles, who is a black drag queen in New York, originally rose to fame during the 1990s and then kind of like died out a little bit and then resurfaced in the 2000s with the premiere of RuPaul's Drag Race Drag U, and then RuPaul's Drag Race Drag All-Stars. Some of the critiques surrounding RuPaul and the shows, Letting It All Hang Out is her autobiography, but then some of the critiques that have occurred in regard to the show is like this adherence to white hegemonic ideals of femininity and how the queens that most closely adhere to that move up the fastest in the show and most predominantly win. There are also racist individuals of color are viewed as racist and stereotypical commodities. And then finally, white drag performers on the show are actually praised and rewarded for culturally appropriating marginalized racial and ethnic identities. So kind of setting the scene about like this research. So Junction City is here, Manhattan is here, Topeka is here, and then Lawrence is here. So it's kind of like right here where my field sites predominantly are. But also kind of looking at how marginalized identities fit into the general like socio-political landscape of the state of Kansas. So according to the United States Census 2014 statistics, people of color comprise 24.6% of the total population of the state. So slightly less than 1/4 of the entire state identify on the U.S. Census as something other than exclusively white. And I get that the census in and of itself is flawed, and that this does not actually directly reflect true demographics of the state of Kansas, but based on information available, this is what I'm going with, which is still really bad. According to the State of Kansas Office of Secretary of State voter registration statistics from 2015. 44.5% of those registered to vote identify as Republican, and another 30.7% were unaffiliated with a political party. So almost 3/4 of the state also identify with a political party that has become increasingly more hostile toward all marginalized populations, not just individuals of color or queer communities, but Trump is, just like a really great example of that, since you also referenced him. And then finally, according to the Human Rights Commission State Equality Index from 2015, there are 0 non-discrimination laws or policies statewide protecting queer people from facing discrimination in housing, employment in the private sector, private accommodations, education, adoption, foster care, and acquiring insurance or credit. Kansas also has a State Religious Freedom Act, so any person who is queer or is perceived to be queer can be discriminated against at any time at the discretion of public establishments, of private establishments. And so this state really does not possess a lot of marginalized individuals. And then when we're looking at double, triple, or even quadruple jeopardy of identities of marginalization within the state, it becomes an incredibly hostile sociopolitical climate for individuals. And then next are some of the examples of field sites that I've used. So Excalibur Club and Skivvies. Excalibur Club was formerly located in Junction City, and then Skivvies Bar and Grill was formerly located in Topeka. Both were created by and for queer communities exclusively. But since beginning this research, both have actually closed. Excalibur Club closed in 2014, and Skivvies closed this past March. And so it created this vacuum and need for safe spaces within the context of Kansas, not only in central Kansas, but just in Kansas as a whole. So the Devil's Tail became the replacement for Junction City, and Topeka is currently still searching for a replacement. And then the Jazz House exists in Lawrence as a field site. Excalibur Club and Skivvies both offered weekly drag performances. The Devil's Tail offers monthly, the Jazz House offers monthly, and then the 2 field sites that I use here in Manhattan are both annual. So these are many of the methods that I've used throughout my entire research process. Participant observation has actually moved into participant action research, where I really work with the community to kind of address problems that they have, and then help work with them to find solutions. I use various interviewing techniques. One thing that is more contemporary, a more contemporary research method that I use are informal focus groups, which typically occur actually in back rooms while performers are getting ready for shows. Either myself or a performer will throw out a question, and pretty much everyone who's in the cast, whether or not they formally help me with the research, will essentially respond, and it will create this really great and very wealthy dialogue among all of the performers. Photography is very dominant. It has existed since I originally began this research, and I use it as a way to further solidify what the performers are actually saying, and the themes and results that are being reached. I originally began presenting this information as ethnography, which has since moved to critical ethnography, and one way that I continue to bring and incorporate performers into this research process is after I've written massive chunks of text, I will actually send it back to the performers to make sure the results that I have and conclusions that I've come to are accurate, and if they're not, I work and have those conversations with the performers to make sure that the conclusions that are being reached are accurate. And I do a couple other things to make sure that results and conclusions are as accurate as possible, and that I'm just not sitting up on this pedestal, this research pedestal, and acting like I know exactly what's happening, because it's their knowledge and their experiences, not mine. So moving into introduction of queens. Let's begin with Monica Marais. She is about 40 years old and has performed in drag for about 25 years. She began performing in drag in Wichita at 17 years old. She began her career aspiring to adhere to a white hegemonic ideal as closely to a white hegemonic ideal of femininity as possible, and has since moved into this identity of a comedy queen. And that really shines through when she's on the stage and on the microphone, and she frequently evokes laughter. She has performed internationally, including in Canada and Denmark, and also has performed all over the United States, including headlining a 2-year show at the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas. She now only performs in drag annually when she returns to her alma mater, Kansas State, to host the annual K-State drag show. And she is known for the comedy and activism within her performances. Outside of drag, she identifies as a cisgender white gay man. Next up is Brianna Jane. She is about 29 years old and has performed in drag for more than a decade. She began her drag career at 17 years old in Junction City, Kansas. She also has performed all over the state of Kansas, as well as when she lived in Omaha, Nebraska, and Colorado Springs, Colorado. She also performed there. She identifies herself as a fluid queen, which means she incorporates different components of drag into her personal aesthetic, and she is most known for her dancing skills, as well as the characters she can portray on the stage. Some of the characters she is most known for include Elsa from Frozen, Maleficent from the self-titled movie, Neytiri from James Cameron's Avatar, which is pictured on the right, and Jack Skellington from The Nightmare Before Christmas, pictured on the left, among others. And then outside of drag, she identifies as a white cisgender gay man who is also HIV positive. Next up is Ellie Monet. She is about 60 years old and has performed in drag for about a decade. She originally began performing at the age of about 50 in Junction City and has performed almost exclusively in central Kansas cities. Ellie Monet identifies as, quote, a comedy queen and a campy queen, and she is most well known for her self-described over-the-top tacky costumes that are often from the 1960s and 70s, often found in the back of her mother's closet. Outside of drag, she identifies as a white cisgender gay man who is also HIV positive. Next up is Lil Kim Chi. She is about 26 years old and has performed in drag for about 8 years. She began performing at 19 years old in Junction City and has performed throughout the state of Kansas and other surrounding states, including Nebraska and Missouri. Lil Kim Chi began her drag career identifying as, quote, a comedy queen and still identifies that way today. She is most known for her non-politically correct performances, and an example of this is during the winter holiday season, she'll dress up and perform as the Virgin Mary and abort the baby Jesus on stage. Outside of drag, Lil Kim Chi identifies as a cisgender gay man. Self-identifying as half black and half South Korean, she said she chose the name Lil Kim Chi as a way to represent both of her racial and ethnic identities, a play on words combining Lil Kim, a black 1990s female rapid hip-hop artist, and kimchi, a South Korean side dish. Next up is Victoria Fox. She is about 26 years old and has performed in drag for about 8 years. She originally began performing in drag at about 18 or 19 years old here in Manhattan. She has performed throughout the state of Kansas, surrounding states including Nebraska and Missouri, and then also currently now almost exclusively performs in the Dallas, Texas area where she currently lives. She began her drag career identifying as a female impersonator, impersonating mainstream white female artists and musicians well known in the United States such as Cher, Britney Spears, and Lady Gaga, but now identifies as wanting to aspire to adhere to a white hegemonic ideal of femininity. She is most known for her ability to, quote, look like a woman. Now located in Dallas, she has also adapted her drag aesthetic to mirror the drag aesthetic that is well known in Dallas. And everything, including drag, is actually bigger in Texas, and she personifies that through incorporating bigger hair, more vibrant makeup, and very, very elaborate costuming. And that can be seen most well at the K-State drag show, where she will also get like 12 backup dancers, and she's always just kind of doing the most. Outside of drag, she identifies as a white cisgender gay man. Next up is Tae Woo. She is about 35 years old and has performed in drag for more than 8 years. She originally began performing in drag at the age of 28 here in Manhattan to actually promote her master's thesis in theater. She predominantly performs in drag in cities in central Kansas, and she identifies herself as a fluid queen, but differently than how Brianna Jane identifies herself as a fluid queen. Two things that make Tae Woo very distinct as a fluid queen are two things. First, she is most well known for her resourcefulness with her costuming, frequently recycling materials for headpieces that she will perform in. Two examples are shown here. So this is a recycled Halloween wig that she glued black sequins to make more detailed and kind of campy on the stage. And then over here on the right, she glued an oversized red rose to a red wig cap to use as a headpiece instead of actually hair as a wig. And then the second thing she's most well known for is she is also known for performing live vocals in almost all of her performances. Outside of drag, she identifies as a black cisgender gay man. And then finally, Brittany Bottoms, who is the youngest as well as the least experienced performing in drag. She is about 22 years old and has only performed in drag for about 3 years. She began performing at the age of 18 in Junction City and has performed predominantly in cities in central Kansas. She originally began her career wanting to aspire to a white hegemonic ideal of femininity, most seen from people who helped bring her into the drag community here in central Kansas, but now actually identifies as a social queen. While she loves performing on the stage in drag, she also loves interacting with the audience. And so she actually really prefers having that interaction in the context of a drag performance space, interacting with the audience more than actually being on the stage, lip syncing to a song. So outside of drag, she identifies as mixed race, consisting of black, white, and Puerto Rican, cisgender gay man. And so the general results of this research are pretty simple. All 7 of these individuals, some more articulate than others, pretty much don't view their race as their master status. 5 of the 7 identify their sexual orientation as their master status, and the other 2 identify something that actually is a positionality of privilege as their master status. And so when they discussed navigating racial dynamics in drag culture, most often they viewed the jokes that could be perceived as racist as that jokes. They didn't think about how the audience could potentially interpret what could be perceived as racist outside of the context of a drag performance area / space. And even drag performers of color who are blatantly called out of things that are stereotypical or are mocking their racial or ethnic identity, they still just shrug it off and play it as a joke. Most often these racial dynamics occur while on the microphone, while on stage, while in drag, but sometimes it does carry off stage. So that's not what I expected, but that is the results that I found. So that is my research, and I am now open to questions.